So I want to go ahead and talk about sermon writing. And the next few moments, I'm going to give you guys a step-by-step guide to writing biblically faithful and pastorally sensitive sermons. Now, something that you guys should know is um, Pastor Steffi mentioned this earlier, but I write sermons for our church every week. But a few years ago, I had no idea how to write a sermon. In fact, the whole process of writing a message from nothing but a passage just seemed very mystifying to me. It seemed very intimidating. I remember my friend sent me a sermon that he had written on the topic of purity. Okay, and I remember getting this email with a Word doc attachment, opening it up, and then seeing just pages of a really well written sermon with points. It was coherent, it was catchy, it was engaging. There were illustrations, and I just remember feeling like this seemed very intimidating, and I didn't think that it was something that I could do. It just, like I mentioned, it seemed very mystifying to me. And I was curious, how do you go from nothing to having a full length sermon that is coherent, engaging, etc. But then not long after that, I took a course on how to teach the Bible. And I learned that, like almost anything, there is a technique to writing sermons well and to writing sermons that are good and biblically faithful, engaging. And that doesn't remove the need for prayer. It doesn't remove the need for discernment and wrestling. But knowing that there is a technique does make the process a lot less intimidating. And it does remove a lot of the mystery to sermon writing. In other words, you don't have to be this spiritual guru to write a really good sermon. And so I want to give you guys some of that technique today. So, what is the process of sermon writing? Well, I broke it down into 4 steps, okay? The first step is to pray. Okay, so prayer. Step 2 is to study the passage. So, study the passage. Step 3, write the sermon. And step 4, prepare for delivery. That's it. Not mysterious, not mystifying. It's pray, study the passage, write the sermon, prepare for delivery. That's all it takes. So let's go ahead and talk about each step in a little bit more detail. So first, let's talk about prayer. As we just learned, when we're delivering a sermon, we're not just giving a public address. We're not just engaging in public speaking, but we are preaching the very words of God. And we're entrusted with this task to preach God's word faithfully to his people. And so obviously, this is not something that we want to do on our own or in our own strength and wisdom, but we want to do this in reliance upon the Lord. And so it's very important that whenever we enter into the process of writing a sermon, we start with prayer. And I put an asterisk next to pray because this isn't something that you just do once at the beginning of the sermon, check it off your list, and then you don't have to worry about prayer anymore. Rather, prayer is something that we do throughout the writing process. If you're stuck at any one point, that's the time to pray. When you're starting to think of illustrations, that's the time to pray. When you're starting to think about the ways that the message will apply to your audience, that's the time to pray. We should be in prayer throughout the sermon writing process because this is something that is super important. It's something that we cannot do in our own strength. And so we need to start and be consistent in prayer. Okay, so that's number 1. Step 2 is study the passage. So before we can deliver a message, before we can craft our points, we need to know what it is we're preaching. We need to get familiar with the passage that we intend to teach on. And so when it comes to studying the passage, there are a few different things that we can do to get familiar with the passage. One, we want to consider the context. Okay, so we want to consider the context. That's things like knowing the genre. Are you reading a letter? Are you reading Old Testament law? Are you reading a creation narrative? You want to know what you're reading. That's going to determine how you understand whatever it is that you're interpreting. Some other things that you might want to consider as far as context is the historical and situational background. For example, if you're reading Paul's letter to the Galatians, you might want to know, why did Paul write this letter? What was going on that made him feel the need to write to this church? It might be important to know if the church was going through persecution at the time. So these are some things we want to look for in the book that we're reading, some things we want to consider and questions we want to ask. Of course, when it comes to context, you also want to think about where your passage fits in, where it fits in the whole letter or book that you're reading. Is this toward the beginning, toward the end? What's going on here? What are the passages before and after? You just want to consider everything revolving around context, because this is going to help you to get to the heart of what your passage is communicating. Once you consider the context, you want to start making observations. So now we're no longer looking at the context, we're looking at the actual passage we want to teach on, and we're just making observations. We're trying to look for important elements of the passage, things that maybe we don't understand, things that we think are really important to the argument. And so we want to just get familiar with our passage. That's another way of understanding this step, is you want to get familiar with your passage. And some examples of what kind of observations you can make include literary observations. So for example, are there rhetorical questions? Is there a dialogue that you're reading? Is there a plot? Is there metaphor or symbolism? You want to look for literary things that might be important. Then there's grammatical observations. Is there a certain word that keeps being repeated? Is there a word that seems important or central to your passage? For example, our passage, if we were going to teach on the whole thing, love, right, would be very important. That's relevant, right? But more important than that is, are there any words that are confusing or vague? For example, when we read Paul talk about the flesh in Romans 8 or in Galatians 5, what's he mean? Is he talking about like this flesh, or is he referring to human nature or something else? And so you want to make grammatical observations based on what seems important, what might be vague or confusing, and what might be open to different interpretations. Then you want to make cultural observations. Now, when it comes to cultural observations, these are basically sayings and practices that seem familiar to the biblical audience, but foreign to us. For example, when Paul talks about head coverings, most people living in America, unless you come from maybe an Eastern background or a Jewish background or whatever, most people are not going to understand that reference or why it's so important. So things like head coverings, or when Paul says a little yeast leavens the dough. I don't know about you, but I've never had to work with yeast or things like that. So you want to look for those kind of things that might be foreign to you, but still important to the passage. And finally, you want to make historical observations. Are there any references to important historical events, whether it's, for example, in the Gospels, mentioning Pilate or Caesar or persecution? So these are just some examples of things you want to look for. And again, the whole point here is that you want to be familiar with your passage. Okay, that's the goal of this step. You want to be familiar with your passage. Okay, so consider the context, make observations, and then one of the most important steps in this part is to determine the big idea. This is the most important part. If you don't get this figured out, don't move on. Don't move on until you can determine the big idea. And basically, the big idea is your ability to say in one or two sentences what the author is trying to communicate through this passage. Okay, so that's what the big idea is. You're just trying to articulate in your own words what is the author trying to communicate in this passage. And the reason why this is so important is because if you cannot articulate the author's point in your own words, then you don't know the passage well enough. And if you don't know the passage well enough, then you shouldn't move on, because you're not confident enough in what the author, you're not confident enough about what the author is trying to say. So again, in one or two sentences, you need to be able to state the author's point. Hope that makes sense. And then finally, you want to infer theological conclusions. So now that you understand the passage, what are some conclusions that we can draw from this passage that might be relevant and useful to put into our sermon? For example, once you know the big idea, you can ask, what does this passage teach us about God, his nature, his character, his works? What does it teach us about people, our nature, the things we struggle with? What does it teach us about our relationship with God? Does this teach us something about salvation or sanctification? And finally, what does this teach us about our relationship with people? So these are questions we should be asking. Once we know the big idea, we feel familiar with our passage, we need to then spend a few moments reflecting on the theological principles embedded in this message, okay? So that's step 2. Consider the context, make observations, determine the big idea, and infer theological conclusions. Once you've studied the passage, now you're ready to actually write your sermon, okay? So when you get to this step, the first thing you do is you don't start with your introduction, okay? You take a few steps back, and you first want to identify your audience. Before you write anything, you should know who you're talking to. Because your sermon's going to look a lot different if you're preaching to the kindergartners versus married couples, right? If you're teaching on Genesis 2, your sermon's going to look a lot different if you're teaching Sunday school, right? Or if you're at a marriage retreat, right? So very first thing you need to do is identify your audience. And for us who are preaching on Sunday, that's going to be a pretty broad audience, but still something that we need to consider. Once you've identified your audience, again, you need to determine the big idea and objectives. So the big idea, we're just carrying that over from the previous step, and we're, again, just putting it into our sermon so we remember what the passage is all about. Because the big idea should govern our sermon. If our sermon is not serving the author's point, then what are we actually preaching on? What are we actually teaching on? And so the message should serve the big idea. And we also want to talk about, or we want to determine our objectives. So the objectives are basically, what are the things we want to accomplish through our sermon? For example, what do you want people to know? This is the cognitive objective. What do you want people to know? What do you want people to feel? This is the affective objective. What do you want people to feel? And lastly, what do you want people to do? This is the behavioral objective. And we want to, the reason why we want to clarify and confirm these things is because these are going to help us. The big idea and the objectives, they're going to help us they're going to give us both direction and focus for our sermon. They're going to give us some parameters, okay? And they're going to basically help us to clarify and crystallize what we want our sermon to be about. And they're ultimately going to save you a lot of time. It's so much better to start with some of these big picture elements than just winging it and just kind of making the sermon as you go. You're going to save a lot of time if you just spend a few minutes determining the big idea and your objectives. They're going to be like guardrails that keep you on track and keep you from just going all over the place. And the objectives obviously should be related to the big idea. They should serve the big idea. And the reason why we have these three is because we want our sermons to minister to and transform the whole person, right? We don't want to just speak to people's minds. We don't want to just give them a list of do's and don'ts, but we want our sermons to transform the head, the heart, and the hands. We want the whole person ministered to. And so it's really important to work these things out, okay? So determine the big idea and your objectives. And even if you just spend a few minutes on this, it'll give a lot of, it'll help bring your message into focus. Finally, you're ready to craft your outline. This is where your message starts to have some real shape to it. And this essentially functions as the skeleton of your sermon. And one thing I'll say about the outline is that this is, I believe, the hardest part of the whole process is coming up with an outline, taking all of your studying, all of your observations, and then actually forging something out of it. Okay, so this is the hardest part of the whole process because you're finally adding some concrete elements to your message. Okay, there are different approaches to the outline that you can take. For example, there's a traditional 3-point method. I'm very fond of this method where you have an introduction, 3 points, and a conclusion. That's very popular. Or you can also use the well-known hook, book, look, took method. Basically, the hook is an attention grabber. The book part, you're reading and explaining the passage. The look part of the message is you're drawing conclusions, principles, and the took is a call to action. Okay, that's also very popular. The kind of outline you use isn't so much that important. What's most important is that you have some kind of structure to your message, because again, this is going to help bring your message into focus. Once you're done with that, you're then ready to write your manuscript. And this is where you basically just fill in your outline. This is where you write your message word for word. And I really encourage you to write out your sermon word for word, because it's going to force you to crystallize your thoughts. Okay, it's going to force you to be able to take whatever ideas you have in your head and actually refine them and put them on paper. And that will ultimately result in a better sermon. Okay, so write your manuscript. And the last thing is to add finishing touches. You can add an attention grabber, like, okay, what do I want my opening line to be? You can add illustrations, okay, for the second point. What story do I want to tell? You can add analogies, personal testimonies. But that's kind of the process of writing your sermon. Okay, you start big with your audience, your big idea, your objectives. You craft an outline, you fill it out, and then you add those finishing touches. And in this way, writing a sermon is very much like painting or doing some kind of art on a canvas. So if any of you are into art, I'm terrible at art, but from observing my art friends, I've noticed that, okay, you start with, your canvas. What size painting do you want to do. You start with maybe an idea of what you want to paint, or a model. You start with the raw materials. Okay, are you going to paint with colored pencil, acrylics, or oil? And then once you have all those things, you make the broad strokes, right? You make a light sketch that kind of puts things into proper proportion and ensures that everything is sized properly. And then you start adding layer by layer, right? In the same way, sermon writing, you have to start with the big picture. You make an outline, and then you fill it in layer by layer. Okay? And then after that, you prepare for delivery. And I only have a few points here, but when you're preparing for delivery, I highly recommend that you rehearse your message at least once. Okay? This helps you to, again, it helps you to figure out what parts you're still not sure of, what parts you still have trouble articulating. It gives you a chance to think about what kind of pauses, or it helps you to think about how you're actually going to deliver the sermon. But most importantly, it forces you, kind of like writing out the sermon, it forces you to crystallize your thoughts that much more. Next, I always recommend print your manuscript. Now, if you want to go off memory, that's great. I think that's something really good to aim for. But you don't want to be the guy who goes up, or the girl who goes on stage, tries to do it from memory, and then you get nervous and your mind goes blank. You don't want to be that guy. Even if you want to memorize your message, just have your manuscript up there as a safety net. That way you never find yourself in a weird predicament where you go on a 5-10 minute detour because you lost your train of thought. So print your manuscript, and when you're delivering your message, be open to the Spirit and sensitive to your audience. You've done all this preparation, and I always tell people that God is at work in the prep. But even when you're delivering, you still want to be open to God. You still want to be open to his leading, just in case he puts something on your heart, or he wants to direct you in the midst of the sermon, or in the middle of the sermon. And be sensitive to your audience. You want to pay attention to the people. Obviously, we're going to film our message. But in a normal setting, you would want to look and see if people are tracking with you. Do they look confused? Are they laughing? Maybe your zipper's down or something. But you just want to be sensitive to your audience and observant. Okay? So that's it. Those are the 4 steps. You want to pray, study your passage, write the sermon, and prepare for delivery. So that's 4 steps that you can take to writing a biblically faithful and pastorally sensitive sermon.